Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Welcome to the first of our academic programs for the year 2020 to 21. I do hope that all of you are staying safe and healthy out there, and it's wonderful to see so many familiar names and so many unfamiliar names in the participants list. As you know, the Huntington is a residential research institute for scholars working in the fields where our collections are strong. And in any given year, we usually have 20 or 24 long-term fellows who are in residence for the full year. This year, of course, circumstances are slightly different, and the reading rooms at the Huntington are not yet open. So it's remarkable that a few hardy souls have come into residence in anticipation of the reading rooms opening for the use of scholars. And one of those hardy souls is Professor Bob Bonner, who you can see here on the screen this evening, who is here for the academic year in residence as the Rogers Distinguished Fellow in 19th-century American history. This was a fellowship created in 2010 to 11 through the generosity of Steve Rogers and his late wife, Janet, to promote research in 19th century American history, and especially the history of the Civil War. The first holder of the fellowship was David Blight, and recent fellows in the Rogers Fellowship have included Steve Cushman, Stephen Hahn, Alice Fars, and Joan Waugh. I'm delighted to introduce Bob Bonner to you this evening. He is the Cather Tapp Vernon Professor in Biography at Dartmouth College. He holds his BA from Princeton and his PhD from Yale. He's held fellowships from the Beinecke Library at Yale, the American Antiquarian Society, the Virginia Historical Society, the Newberry Library, the Gilder Lehrman Institute, and the Connecticut Humanities Institute. He's the author of 4 monographs: Colours and Blood, which was a Choice Outstanding Academic title in 2003, The Soldier's Pen, First-Hand Impressions of the Civil War, which appeared in 2006, Mastering America, Southern Slaveholders and the Crisis of American Nationhood, 2009, and A People's Contest, which appeared in 2010. He's got 2 manuscripts on the go at the moment, both of them coming towards completion. First, a biography of the Confederate Vice President Alexander Hamilton Stevens, and second, a book entitled Slavocrats at Sea, the Global Menace of a Maritime Southern Confederacy. And he's in residence here at the Huntington this year, finishing that project. Before I introduce him, I should say a word about the format. We have been experimenting with programs that are both synchronous and asynchronous. That is to say that Bob is actually here in real time, about 3 miles from where I am in Pasadena, and he will be handling the Q&A live. But the talk itself is pre-recorded, and we will run that video very shortly. There will be a break after about 20 minutes, during which you can gather your thoughts to think about questions that you might want to submit through the Q&A button. So without any further ado, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Bob, for being here in residence this year. To discuss Confederate infamy, please welcome the 2021 Rogers Distinguished Fellow, Professor Bob Bonner.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that introduction. It's what I have sort of at the bottom of my list of things to thank you for. Enormously grateful for the opportunity to spend this year in Southern California. I haven't gone to the library yet this time around, but I was able to be here last November as the Bruce and Marty Coffey Fellow. Got to do a little reconnaissance on this project, and there's a lot to find here when the time comes. Besides Steve, thanks to all the staff that I got to know last winter and have begun to interact with remotely. It's been really wonderful to see how imaginative they've been in supporting those of us who are out here. Steve Rogers, I haven't met yet, but certainly thanks to him. The Coffeys, thanks to them. The fellows, both from last year, it's not uncomplicated to relocate to Southern California from the East Coast. So the former fellows, some of whom I see are in the audience tonight, were great in terms of advice, and the current fellows as well, who have just gotten to know in the same format that we have here, which is Zoom. I'm really looking forward to developing really meaningful relationships with this great group of people over the next 9 months or so. As might be expected, as a Civil War historian, I find myself endlessly intrigued by the removal of Confederate monuments from cities like Richmond, Mobile, New Orleans, and other places, particularly in the Deep South. This is a year in which we are experiencing so many unexpected developments. The one that I think stands out, and that really has helped me to think about the comments that I'm going to be conveying tonight, is the simple premise that the ways in which we think about the past bears directly on the present. Reimagining the one helps to reimagine the other, and perhaps can also help chart a future that's better than either the present or the past has been. With those thoughts in mind, I will be introducing the topic of Confederate infamy tonight with an eye towards current events. Specifically, my emphasis on the theme of Black enslavement and subordination and degradation by representatives of the Confederate government couldn't be more timely. This, of course, is a central part of the discourse of 2020. It'll be my contention, though, that it's also a central ingredient of the efforts of opponents of the Confederate States of America during the war, and especially overseas, to lay an indictment against the new government as an aggressive, ambitious slaving power. Now, before I get into the framing of thinking just a bit about the year 2020, I do want to acknowledge that I'm not a scholar of contemporary events, even though in questions and answers I can make clear some of the work of other scholars who I've depended on in thinking about the moment that we now are living through, in which the legacy of the War for the Union continues to shape American public life. I'm a 19th century historian, of course, that's why I'm holding the Rogers Distinguished Fellowship, and I'm spending this year in Southern California exploring the Confederacy on the high seas. This is not a project that deals in any meaningful way with the memory of the 1860s. That's not one of its main objectives, with one key exception. And that is, I have grown increasingly convinced that the light imprint of naval activities in our popular imagination of the Civil War years means that this project will involve an act of rediscovery and re-awareness of a line of argument that made the Confederate government not just a slaving power, but a pirate power, a rogue regime in the eyes of outside observers. Now, as we think about the ways in which the naval story is filtered out of the broader awareness of what the Confederate government represented, I will think a little bit about the notion of the lost cause. This is a concept that historians use not to think about the war itself, but to think about the ways in which its legacy was preserved and celebrated by its defenders in the wake of surrender. This was a project in which statues to common soldiers and then to heroes such as Robert E. Lee, depicted here in Richmond's Monument Avenue, set the terms of thinking about what the struggle for Confederate nationhood was all about. It was a strongly positive depiction that centered not on the government and not even on politics, but on the attributes of valor, of bravery, of military prowess that allowed the generation that began the lost cause to pay homage. Everyone knows that this is a legacy that is now being dismantled in all sorts of interesting ways. What I'd like to do is to think a little bit about how the dismantling of the lost cause and its presence in American public life works on a few different levels. Part of this is a historical argument, and I think it depends upon the growing awareness that's consistent with how the Civil War is now being taught, and which is also the version of the Civil War that's most consistent with the evidence on the centrality of slavery in explaining the crisis of union. any serious account of the roots of the secession crisis has to acknowledge how important it was for Southern slaveholders to making an increasingly grandiose claims for the future of their institution. And the rise of a new political party to curb those ambitions was what destabilized American politics and made war, rather than political contestation, the defining characteristic of the early 1860s. Another key theme that has grown up over in this effort to dismantle lost cause vestiges of the 1860s concerns not the warriors itself, but the patterns of memorializing in a positive way the military saga. This conversation has involved a recognition that there is a strong correlation between those years in which racial control was being tightened in the South by whites and the proliferation of Confederate commemoration. We can see an upsurge in Confederate activity that coincides with the Jim Crow years, and then again a return to this symbolism during the massive resistance to the civil rights campaigns of the 1860s. Now, anyone paying attention has realized that this is under assault, and to extend this timeline from one that emphasizes how the lost cause was established to how it's being dismantled, needs to think a little bit about the year 2020, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement. 2020 has witnessed a series of attempts to balance the heroic story of generals on horseback with other kinds of heroism, particularly that associated with the civil rights movement. Here, a lighting design artist projected the image of John Lewis on the base of the monument to Robert E. Lee to call into question whether or not the heroism of those who fought in the 1860s really was consistent with the kind of society that Richmond wants to establish for the future. This conversation between past, present, and future has another important pivotal moment in the year 2017. Most infamously, this involved the murderous Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, but it also involves something that I predict will be in textbooks of the future, which is the address that Mayor Mitch Landrieu gave to the city of New Orleans prior to his removal of statues like this one to Robert E. Lee from that city on the Gulf Coast. Mitch Landrieu's address is worth taking some time with, and I do this often, more and more often as I'm teaching the Civil War to my college undergraduates. It stages an emotional scene that's worth taking a measure of. Landrieu wants us to imagine an African-American mother or father trying to explain to a fifth grade daughter why Robert E. Lee sits atop the city. Can you look into the eyes of that young girl and convince her, even as her parents, that he is there to encourage her? He asks. And when you look into that child's eyes as a parent, you see the moment when the searing truth comes into focus. It's a truth both about the falsity of the lost cause notion of a disinterested rebellion, but also a truth about why this legacy and how we remember this legacy matters for the development of a city going forward. What Landrieu called an accurate recitation of our full past was needed because the monuments gave something that was an affront to our present and a bad prescription for our future. He concluded that instead of revering a 4-year brief historical aberration that was called the Confederacy, he wanted New Orleanians to celebrate all 300 years of our rich, diverse history and set the tone for the next 300 years to come. Now, many of those themes that we are hearing, both in the celebration of the Confederacy and its ill reputation, as according to figures like Landrieu, were established during the war itself.
This was of particular importance in a global context. There's very high stakes in terms of the Confederacy's appeal to outside powers to recognize its existence, and it might have been the hinge on which Confederate independence turned in some respects. In this international appeal, we do see a glorification of the Confederate military effort. This is something I'm largely going to be taking for granted tonight, as I turn my attention instead to the infamy of the Confederate government on the one hand and of its navy on the other. In these depictions, again, circulated by supporters of the Union cause, the Richmond-based government was seen as a menacing rogue state set to propagate slavery and to offer white racial domination as a model for the rest of the world. I'd like to begin with this early satire of Confederate ill repute that appeared in the illustrated weekly Harpers in 1861. It doesn't have military images, as you can see, and the simple explanation for that is that it predates major military operations. The story it tells is of a power that might not be worthwhile to incorporate into the global community, that it might not be trustworthy enough to make into a fully sovereign nation. As a coin, it's a satire on what the Confederacy should be representing itself as if it were to be honest. On the left, we see motto ex uno plurima, turning upside down the United States motto of pluribe unum. The centrifugal states of North America speaks to the anarchic tendencies of a disruption in a federal form. The figure of the pistol and the Bowie knife on the left-hand side show the propensity of violence within this society. The right-hand image, "Oh, ever paid never," speaks to the folly of lending money to this ragtag regime because you would never be paid back, in part because Southern states repudiated debt in very infamous ways during the 1830s and 1840s. But we also see slavery here, and that's what I think is critical. On the right-hand side, we see slavery in the form of plantation workers being supervised with an overseer with a whip behind the back. And then in the left-hand corner, the one that really catches my eye for reasons I will explain, is the crouching figure of the slave on whose back the entire edifice rests. I immediately recognize this as a reference to the cornerstone speech of Vice President Alexander H. Stephens, delivered in Savannah in March of 1861. On that occasion, Stephens proclaimed his expectation that the Confederate Constitution would stand the test of time, primarily because, and here I'm going to use his exact language, its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon a great truth, and that is that the Negro is not equal to the white man, and that slavery, subordination to the superior white race, is his natural and normal condition. Now, I've been thinking about Stephens for a long time because I'm in the very last stages of completing a biographical work about him and about his defense of the Confederacy. But the speech is becoming more and more prevalent in discussions. It, in fact, was part of how Mitch Landrieu laid out the case for the removal of the R.E. Lee statue in New Orleans. Now, Stephens, a fascinating figure for those of you who have come across him in other contexts, depicted here as kind of a brooding, contemplative, sort of dreamy person in this middle image, which is a photograph from the 1850s. Went out of his way to think about how this commitment to racial slavery that formed the very basis of the Confederate project heralded a wider acceptance that he thought would be accepted on a global level. Our new government, he continued in the same speech, is the first, not the last, but the first in the history of the world to be based on a great physical, philosophical, and moral truth of white racial superiority. He went on and said that the truth of this racial superiority has been slow in the process of development, but like other truths, in the various departments of science. It was destined to be embraced as the only way of ordering human affairs. This sort of provocative, in-your-face claim was a coup for Union publicists because it did the work of depicting the Confederacy not as the victim of an aggressive United States effort, but as a menace to the rest of the world. This draws us to the final component of this slide, in the hand of Abraham Lincoln, held among his papers at the Library of Congress, which was authored by him in April of 1863 as a suggestion for how international gatherings should pass a series of resolutions related to the nature of the Confederate project. It read, whereas while heretofore states and nations have tolerated slavery, recently, for the first time in the world, an attempt has been made to construct a new nation upon the basis of, and with the primary and fundamental object, to maintain, enlarge, and perpetuate human slavery. Therefore, it was resolved that no such embryo state should ever be recognized or admitted into the family of Christian and civilized nations. And in fact, it should by all lawful means be resisted to the utmost. Here, I think we see Lincoln drawing a fine line, separating the Confederacy's intent to maintain, enlarge, and perpetuate bondage that might set it apart in the world of 1860s statecraft from other pro-slavery powers. Brazil still practiced slavery, Spain and Cuba still practiced slavery, the United States in areas like Kentucky and Delaware still was seeing slavery as a functioning, legitimate institution. To emphasize the aggressive nature of the kind of government that Alexander Stephens called for, set the Confederacy apart as uniquely incapable of membership within the series of the system of sovereign states. The key menace that international observers saw in the specter of an independent Confederacy involved a rapacious thirst for increasing domination, particularly as it involved territorial gains, projecting power on behalf of slavery into areas like Texas in the 1840s, into the Mexican Cession, in the struggle over territorial slavery. During the 1850s, the murmuring that consumed Southern politics about adventurism in the tropics, that all caught the eye of international observers and made them take notice of something that might threaten civilization itself. Global attention, by contrast, found it somewhat perplexing for Kansas to become the place where the American political system really fell apart between the creation of territorial Kansas in 1854 and its statehood that was assured the very moment a free soil president assumed power in 1861. International discussion of the Kansas issue wondered aloud about why the empty and arid plains were generating so much controversy. And perhaps the best explanation for this, in their view, was the dysfunction at the very basis of US politics. Now, this Victorian discussion, which maybe belittled the plains, paid a little bit more attention to the tropics, paid the highest premium on the topic that we'll turn to now, the high seas. This was where modern globalization was achieving some of its most breathtaking successes. The 1860s was in the middle of an extraordinary expansion of mass transfer of people and goods. Human mastery of the oceans seemed to be a possibility, given the enormous technological innovations of steam and the scientific advances that included a system of coordinating time and longitudinal position via the prime meridian established at Greenwich, England. An American-led effort to map ocean currents and prevailing winds in the first international study of the physical geography of the sea was also at stake in this world. It's from that project that this image, it's a remarkable image, is taken. It's the effort by Virginia scientist Matthew Fontaine Maury to sketch a world that would be menaced by the Confederate peace strategy that Maury himself played a hand in fashioning. It was created by the digital historian Benjamin Schmidt of Northeastern University, compiling 1.3 million geographic coordinates that Maury compiled.
Thank you, Ben. We're halfway through Bob Bonner's Rogers Distinguished Fellows lecture. We're going to pause very briefly so that you can collect your thoughts out there in the audience in terms of asking questions. Please remember to use the Q&A function in the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom platform. And we look forward to taking those questions into account during our conversation after the conclusion of the lecture. Ben, back over to you.
I'd like you to imagine, in considering this image, just the Confederate period, and to break down the aggregate depiction of all of these voyages into 5 different groups, each of which play a slightly different role in my story. 3 groups became targets if they flew the United States flag. There were merchant ships of steadily increasing tonnage. There were whalers, which was a favorite of rebels who wanted to stick it to the abolitionist New England interest. And then there were steam passenger liners, where vulnerable female travelers became a theme with the sensational press. A 4th group of ships were those advanced naval ships that set the pace for speed and firepower. The US was playing a game that was dominated by the British, but it committed early on to a coastal blockade, meaning that the small Confederate naval force, just as advanced as we'll soon see, largely had a free hand across the far-flung oceans. And then there was a final group, the slavers, who after 1850 shifted their shadowy and illicit trafficking of enslaved Africans from buyers in Brazil to a booming and highly lucrative market in Spanish Cuba. That panoramic view of the mid-19th century oceans can now be supplemented by zooming in on 2 Confederate vessels attempting to disrupt this world, a fairly ordinary brig built in Baltimore in 1845, and a very high-tech machine launched from Birkenhead in 1862 and commanded by this figure, Raphael Semmes of the Alabama. The first of these, the 200-ton Putnam, plied Atlantic rail routes until 1857, when Brazilian interests based in New York outfitted it as a slaver, renamed it the Echo, and sailed it to Cabinda to board 450 enslaved Africans. After the death of 1/3 of these captives in transit, U.S. naval patrollers seized it as an illegal slaver off Cuba's coast and took refugees to Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, where dozens more died. The Echo's crew and its captain faced charges of piracy. They were quickly acquitted by pro-slavery juries, and the ship passed to ownership of Charleston interests. In the aftermath of the 1860 presidential election and South Carolina's secession from the Union, these owners renamed the ship the Rattlesnake and petitioned for a letter of marque and reprisal from the new Confederate administration. They sought a commission that outsourced raiding to private interests, compensating for the fact that Jefferson Davis inherited a government that, for all intents and purposes, had to start from scratch. Before its privateering voyage, the Putnam Echo Rattlesnake was renamed for a 4th and final time, and the Jeff Davis, painted black for disguise, became the linchpin of a small flotilla that would prey upon about a dozen unsuspecting U.S.-flagged ships. 5 of these were taken to prize courts, and the rest were either destroyed or recaptured by crews as they sailed towards Confederate harbors. Here, the scene of a piratical vessel with a black man with a hatchet in his hand will be explained in further detail as we move ahead. Now, the outsized press coverage of the Jeff Davis turned on the debate of whether it was a pirate ship manned by latter-day buccaneers worthy of execution. There was a related question. Was the government that was willing to issue letters of marque a fit representation of modern civilization? This was the message of a detailed 1861 print shown here, in which rebels standing before a satanic throne featured Alexander Stephens of Cornerstone fame, brazenly displaying the criminality of what was termed the fundamental principles of our government. The captain above him brandished a letter of marque, which was every bit as notorious. Unlike villainy or inequity, or being deplorable or odious for that matter, this pirate category that turned on the letter of marque was a legalism about what was permissible in international waters when sovereignty did not extend past the deck of a flagged ship. The legal vacuum blurred civilized norms, though it was custom that reached all the way back to Roman times to consider some forms of maritime banditry to be worthy of condemnation as enemies of all mankind, and these pirates being fit for execution if convicted of such a crime. The U.S. position on whether the Confederate privateers were pirates was simple. This was a fake government, and allowing private citizens to wield guns at sea was no better than what later generations would term hijacking. A New York jury agreed with this logic and imposed death sentences on the crews of those privateers that were prosecuted. The verdict was set aside, however, when Richmond threatened retaliatory killings of U.S. soldiers that they held as prisoners. There was also an international response to Confederate privateering. It was uniformly critical of Confederate marque as a major relapse into the barbarism of an earlier high seas regime. Here it's important to know that just 5 years earlier, in 1856, nearly all the maritime powers, the U.S. excepted, importantly, had joined the Declaration of Paris, and in doing so had pledged to cease marque-based privateering. But it was not the international condemnation that would end this episode, but its ineffectiveness is seen in the career of the Jeff Davis, which foundered after being pursued by a U.S. naval ship, but also by the allure of even greater bounty in the realm of blockade running for those who went to sea in search of riches. And that is probably the best explanation of the appeal of privateering overall. The efforts to imperil Union seaborne economic interests thus passed from brigs like the Jeff Davis to a small fleet of advanced commerce raiders, directed by full-fledged members of the Confederate States Navy, like Raphael Semmes, pictured here aboard the Alabama at Table Bay, South Africa. While less objectionable in purely legal terms, this small group of raiders would achieve far more infamy. And it's, again, Semmes's image that was advertised in the Pirate Semmes for this talk this evening. The CSS Alabama was state-of-the-art in almost every respect. It came out on one of the leading shipyards of the British Empire with teak and high-quality pine construction that drew immediate attention. It had a cutting-edge marine engine that assured maneuverability in pursuit of its prey or an escape from advanced Union naval ships. It had a retractable screw propeller and a smokestack that also could be retracted, and that made it very fast under sail when coal was running low. It had lethal armament, again of British design, such as the cannon that Semmes is leaning upon here. It was the sort of shark of the Confederacy, and the ship would generate a tremendous lore based upon its effectiveness. Named in its honor are the Alabama Hills, which this summer's LA Times presented as California's own echo of the Confederate lost cause. It also inspired a British drinking song, Roll Alabama Roll, and similar sea sallies in South Africa, which narrate a remarkable tour that disrupted 450 voyages, captured 2,000 prisoners, and destroyed over 60 ships with a value totaling $6 million. There's a large body of work devoted to the Alabama's infamy. These tend to emphasize two different aspects of its history. First was its associations with Raphael Semmes, who was a larger-than-life figure. The second notable part of the Alabama's reputation was its global expanse. as the ship logged some 75,000 miles under steam and sail, being only surpassed by the CSS Shenandoah, a circumnavigating ship that would be the last to surrender in Liverpool in 1865, after a flurry of assaults upon whalers in the Bering Sea. Now, there's a third aspect to the voyage that has already begun to come into focus in recent work, but which centers the research I'm now conducting across the expanse of Confederate maritime activity. This is how the Alabama fit within the framework of pro-slavery propagandism, and how Semmes' infamous reputation was tarnished not only by his firing of enemy vessels, but by his thoroughgoing public commitment to white supremacy. I'd like to think through the vulnerability of Black mariners to Confederate raiders like Semmes by circling back to the privateer Jeff Davis and saying a bit more about that episode of a Black man with a hatchet in his hand shown in an earlier slide. This is the same scene, and it existed not on the Jefferson Davis itself. We actually have no image of that ship, even if as the Putnam, the Echo, the Rattlesnake, or the Davis, but on one of its prizes, the S.J. Waring, a schooner which was seized at Cannonport early in a journey from New York to Buenos Aires, carrying a cargo worth $100,000. 5 Confederates from the Jeff Davis went aboard the Waring, and they remained, steering it to Charleston so the ship could legally become its captor's property. In addition to the reward of the Waring's considerable value and that of its cargo, these 5 sailors saw a potential windfall in carrying a Black steward by the name of William Tillman, who, despite being free, was a potential commodity that could have fetched a high price in Confederate slave markets. Tillman, by now you can conclude he's the one with the hatchet in his hand, later reported that he had overheard a discussion of the particulars of this kidnapping into bondage being discussed by the captain and the first mate. This inspired him to take up arms against both men, as well as a third. All 3 bodies were thrown overboard, and he overpowered the remaining 2 Confederates, but spared their lives so that they could assist him in sailing the boat to New York, where he would be greeted as the Union's first genuine maritime hero. Tillman's story is suggested by this piece of popular literature, circulated in popular culture. It coincided with a less bloody and less celebrated incident aboard the Enchantress, another Jeff Davis prize, whose Black cook, a man named Jacob Garrett, revealed its identity by jumping overboard during an inspection of the ship by suspicious blockaders. Revealing the truth about this ship, whose commanders had pretended that it was just a regular vessel, and its links to the rebellion, was critical to Garrett for the same reason that Tillman's actions were critical to him. He too feared being reduced to chattel were he to be taken into a Confederate port. Lawyers who prosecuted the case against the privateers, who seized the Enchantress and then who were in turn seized by a blockading force, insisted that preying upon Garrett's vulnerability as a free Black man at sea was, quote, an offense without feeling, because to tear a man from his home and to enslave him forever against the usages of warfare stamps this transaction as a piratical, outrageous aggression without any of the color or the forms of law. This was supplemented the case against the illegitimacy of Mark, in which the privateering cases turned. Now, no such incident involving a captured African American who would receive freedom marked the Alabama Voyages, though Semmes did detain some Black prisoners in ways that leave room to suspect that they too were in danger. It was the words uttered by Semmes that made his command of the Sumter and the Alabama analogous to white supremacists' pirate cruises. More than any other fighting figure, Semmes had already developed a robust defense of racial slavery in a best-selling memoir of his service during the Mexican War. As an ideologue turned war commander and hero, Semmes had few counterparts in the celebrated Confederate armies. His status as a pro-slavery ideologue was clear upon his entry into ports of Brazil and Spain, where he mimicked Alexander Stephens in announcing that since Southerners were, quote, fighting the first battle in the favor of slavery, their cause should be supported by all who still had an interest in chattel bondage. The captain set the tone for the crew, who left a tombstone 4 feet by 2 feet on a small island off the Yucatan coast early in 1863, and affixed upon it this message: in memory of A. Lincoln, who died of inward on the brain, January 1st, 1863, marking the proclamation of the Emancipation Proclamation. Sims continued in his Reconstruction era journalism to rail against black rights in Memphis and then Mobile. In 1868, at a Democratic rally, he promised that a presidential victory that fall mattered mostly because it would work to, quote, reduce the Negro to a subordinate position as the inferior race. Here's an image of Sims as pro-slavery propagandist rather than as maritime commander that sort of summons up his defiant attitude and his disregard for the fact that by 1868, these comments were likely to backfire as much on the Democrats as not. Now, overlaying popular discussion of both black resistance to privateering and of Sims' ugly global propagandizing was a booming Atlantic slave trade. I've mentioned this several times in passing, but now I'd like to bring this into a bit clearer focus. The persecutors of the Echo refugees failed to traffic them to Cuba sugar plantations, but countless other slavers were successful in just such a criminal enterprise. How many others will never be known for sure, since this was illicit activity done in the shadows by powerful syndicates required to shift their mode of operations from the large-scale slaving of the so-called legal era prior to 1808. A trade criminalized thereafter by England and the United States was not so much abolished as driven underground, where embarkation canoes like the one sketched here in 1849 for the Illustrated London News exemplified guile, deception, forged papers, and other scurrilous, shady activities that became routine in the 1850s and were still in progress at the start of the American Civil War. Trafficking in African captives was a variant of international crime. It resembled not just the piracy of earlier centuries, but anticipated the exploits of modern money launderers, counterfeiters, drug and gun runners. That was its ethos. And that is what tinged discussion of menace presented by the Confederacy's pro-slavery seaborne mission. International responses to Stevens' speech, I've noticed, regularly linked his propagandizing for slavery in the Cornerstone speech with the prospect that Confederates would strip criminal sanctions away from African slavery and push to make it legal once more. Hints of such a relapse also came with the appointment of William Yancey, a vocal advocate of exactly that policy in the 1850s, to an important diplomatic post in London in 1861. But it's fanciful to imagine that this would have been the case. The power dynamics would have prevented a new Confederate government from defying global opinion in this way. At a time when African slaving really was the epitome of the barbaric evil, any defense of it was seen in Europe as deeply immoral. And yet, an overt embrace of retrograde actions would not be the only form that a pirate state could take to fuel new misery for Africans. The kind of state that cut corners, that welcomed violence, that was defiant of moralizing against it, had any number of threats. The American flag and New York mercantile interests had been a refuge of slavers in the 1850s. Was it so far-fetched to think that the Confederate flag at sea, in a port perhaps like New Orleans or Mobile, might have played the same role were Southern armies victorious in the field? In the small balance of time I have, let me quickly turn to the question of how the Seaborne Menace of the 1860s, laden with his associations with the criminality of African slaving, faded within lost cause traditions. I say faded, but not disappeared, since we do have Sims, one of the most notable figures who would move from his high sea infamy of the 1860s to a post-war notoriety and even a grudging respect within Confederate culture. To pay homage to this raider was not without controversy, and there would be pushback. But the language shifted, and the notion that his actions were unacceptable and beyond the pale did shift. Being notorious, and perhaps even acceptable, if taken in the, on behalf of the right cause, rehabilitated his reputation. Even if he was a pirate, and this was not at all conceded by his defenders, was it really so bad that he inflicted the same damage upon Yankee interests that was inflicted upon plantation ones? In this way, sort of the excusing of his pirateness reached a pinnacle in 1900, when a bronze memorial to him was established in Mobile Harbor, one of really only two important Confederate naval monuments, the other being on Monument Avenue to Matthew Fontaine Maury, discussed earlier. Putting a pirate on a pedestal makes maybe more sense if one considers the strangeness that we continue to celebrate, for instance, athletic teams by naming them the Pirates or the Marauders or the Buccaneers or the Raiders. Swashbuckling romance is something that we associate with the image of this form of criminality that's really given it a sort of free pass in terms of historical reputation and judgment. Now, by 1900, Sims had become embraced by some European theorists, the same ones that led to the German U-boats campaign, as an advocate of sort of unrepentant prey upon commercial interests. The Mobile ceremony, however, presented him simply as a local hero. He looked out across Mobile Bay, even if he did not take part in the famous conflict there, when U.S. Commander David Farragut reportedly shouted, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Sims looked beyond the Gulf and had a set of bronze binoculars to prove the extent of his gaze before the action really lay. And here's a more basic reason that naval heroes like Sims, or villains for that matter, are difficult to place within commemorative traditions. They can't be placed on the terrain where they conducted operations, nor could anyone visit the commemorative landscape to pay either honor to their exploits or to condemn them. As you see in the date on this slide, the statue was removed in 2020 when the city of Mobile witnessed red paint being used to deface the statue with the words "Confederate scum" across the bronze. Another message read, "We built it, help them rebuild." As these suggest, the terms that arose in the case of the Sims commemorative tribute were almost exactly those that have shaped discussions of monuments to Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson or Jefferson Davis or the common soldier of the Confederacy. Nothing distinctive about his seaborne cruises is part of the 2020 debate. There's something that's provocative about the phrase, "We built it, help them rebuild it," sprayed across this. It represents a variation, I think, of the "we" that Mitch Landrieu discussed. And it might herald something distinctive about Mobile as a center of thinking about the maritime legacy. An NPR story drew attention to this process by which historical memory in this port city is being recast, not just by taking down a monument. Here is the plinth without the monument and a Mobile resident standing below it, but also by paying greater attention to the remarkable story of the Clotilda, a slaver that successfully brought Africans to the coast in 1859. That story is coming into its own thanks to the posthumously published Barracoon of Zora Neale Hurston, of the Smithsonian Slave Wrecks Project, and also of local efforts to mark Africatown, shown here at the bottom, a neighborhood of Clotilda descendants. It's a provocation to think more broadly about the calamities of American history, especially as it concerned slavery and Black subjugation. Going from battlefields to oceans is one move in this direction. Moving from a 4-year period to 4 centuries of misery is another. To venture this theme is not just a way to wind down a talk about Confederate infamy. It can also serve as a piece of advanced publicity to an upcoming event at the Huntington on October 14th. So Wendy Mustakim will explore the endless trauma of the Middle Passage in a talk she titles "Waves of Calamity, Race, Water, and Power in the Evolution of Slavery's Memory."
Terrific. Thank you so much, Bob. I really enjoyed the way in which you moved backwards and forwards with memorialization in the talk. On behalf of everybody in the audience, let me express my appreciation. So to all of you out there, there's lots and lots of you out there, please feel free to submit questions. I'm going to start with a relatively straightforward jurisdictional one from Linda Foreman, who's asking if you could provide the legal context about letters of marque and the jurisdictional issues surrounding letters of marque, since so much of the talk turned on the relationship between legitimate and illegitimate actions at sea. So what is a letter of marque? How do you get one, and what are its terms?
Right. So this was an outsourcing of those sovereigns who were weak naval powers. It dated from the early modern period. The commission had a formulaic quality in which someone with a boat and the ability to put some guns on the boat really was able to seek out a commission, and it would be vested with the protection of the sovereign against, as long as it played by the rules, right? And the rules were that you had to detain only those who were flying the flag of an enemy during a time of war. The privateer then had to take the prize to before a court to condemn the seized property, the prize, and then it would be distributed after that. The key thing though here in terms of placing it within this continuum of what's legitimate and not legitimate is the 1856 action. Just 5 years before Jefferson Davis issues the letters of marque. It's agreed to as a central aspect of the Declaration of Paris to ban that practice. It was only, there's not international law that's binding upon anybody besides signatories, but anyone who signed that agreement gave it up and said, and almost everybody did except the United States for reasons that are somewhat complicated.
Interesting, thank you. I was very struck by your analogy with rogue states in the contemporary world, and especially given the global context of the talk, I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit on the ways in which the notion of the rogue state was shared in the 1860s. Was that a universally held opinion about the Confederacy, or were there some who saw some legitimacy in the regime?
So no, it's certainly not universally held, but I do think it's something I've become more and more interested in. The extent to which a lot of my work, you read the titles of my books when you introduced me. A lot of my work deals with the justification in various ways of the institution of slavery by various actors. I think globally, the way in which a new government, and again, to have the bad luck of having a vice president sort of say the quiet part out loud, and then have that sort of taken up, is part of something I think that's new. The 19th century is an era where there's a lot of new states seeking membership, as the dissolution of the Spanish Empire, Haiti, a lot of new states being formed. I think the question always is the new state viable? But here we have another set of questions, which is and it's really, I think, sort of anticipates the 20th century. Is this state have something about its ideology that makes it makes it a sort of unwelcome? There's a bit of that in the Elijah Gould's book about the treaty worthiness of the early United States, and there's ways in which it could be seen as a disruptive presence and has to overcome that. The Confederacy, I think, is especially around the issue of the increasingly discredited institution of slavery. It really is a major stumbling block. It's discrediting as a rogue state is never. That's not the terminology used. I'm using it anachronistically because I do think it anticipates later our discourse post.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a really interesting analogy. We have a question here that takes us back to the early part of the talk where you were discussing Alexander Hamilton Stevens' own views on racial superiority. And the question is really about the extent to which any of those views were shared in the North. That's all.
Yeah, and that's, I think, from Ed Franks. Yeah, it's a question I get a lot. So, let me just differentiate between views on the one hand and sort of what we actually are talking about with Stevens, which is a little bit more, messianic, I suppose, and a little bit more. And so, something really strange happens the late 40s, 50s, in which sort of is cross-cutting that makes slavery not just something, oh yeah, that's something that we do partly because white. The white race is sort of entitled to that. It really becomes much more sort of elevating slavery as almost a divine institution. And what Stevens is doing is doing that in terms of nationhood, but also in terms of science. And just to answer the question, yes, a lot of what he's drawing from is happening in the North. Ethnology. One of the cornerstone speech is something I've worked on kind of up close. And one of the more interesting defenses of the cornerstone speech comes from Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, who is also kind of a first-class scientific racist. So this is equal opportunity overseas as well. There's sort of there's a way in which people are buying into that version of what the future will hold. Interesting,
thank you. You've talked a lot about the ambiguities of the term pirate and the extent to which pirates as rogues can be almost lovable. But I'm wondering whether anybody, and Mimi is asking this from her iPad, whether any of the protagonists themselves regarded themselves as commanders of pirate fleets in this period, arrogating that term towards themselves.
For the most part, they don't want that. Buccaneers maybe. There's actually a popular song, but it just sort of soften a little bit. But it is a legal term, and there's a lot of distancing both from the privateers and the commerce raiders from that. And I think Stanley Farrard's question is right on target. Just to
sure, go ahead.
Question. He has a question about the intricacies of what actually happened during the piracy trials, and it is the case that they're not hanged, but in part because the jury is sort of complicated, and there's also a sort of statecraft involved in the fact that Confederates hold Union POWs, and there's a retaliatory threat by Jefferson Davis.
Okay, thank you. I hope that keeps you happy, Stan, out there. Can I ask this question with a vested interest, especially in the context of somebody who has just become, in the last couple of days, a US citizen and therefore holds no brief for the British government anymore. But I'm wondering how the participation of the Brits in the maritime context of the Civil War is or is not significant. You made several references to the British context, to Liverpool, indeed.
Mm-hmm. I could have, and I probably should have mentioned more of that because it really is important that this is a major irritant, the complicity of the British government in allowing the Alabama to be built on the Mersey at Birkenhead. It leads to a arbitration in Geneva that's not settled until 1872. Wonderful materials at the Huntington Library having to do with the Lincoln's consul in Liverpool, who is trying to prevent and then trying to prove the case that the British are at fault in allowing basically the most important part of the Confederate Navy to be built within a neutral territory.
Interesting. So we didn't cover ourselves in glory particularly. So I think we will call a halt there. Thank you everybody for attending this evening. Thank you, Bob, for a tour de force lecture through these troubled waters of Civil War historiography. I'm really grateful to you. I'm also grateful to Ben for handling the AV issues so splendidly. And we do hope that many of you will join us again in a month or so to hear the lecture by Sawande Mustakim, to which Bob referred. Many thanks, everybody. Stay safe and stay remotely close. Good night.